This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Margaret Bartley, and I have the very good fortune to be the publisher of the Arden Shakespeare. And Warwick Gould has very kindly given me the very pleasurable duty this evening to welcome you all to this lecture. It's great to see such a full room, and particularly to see so many other Arden editors and friends of Arden and authors of Arden here. I'd especially like to welcome our general editors, Richard Proudfoot and Anne Thompson, who are here tonight. And I was very happy to point out to René, his wonderful copy editor, Jane Armstrong, is with us tonight too. There are many pleasures to be had this evening. It's a great pleasure to thank the Institute for English Studies, and especially Warwick Gould, for creating this really very appropriate collaboration between Arden and the university. Our plan is that this will be the first of many annual Arden lectures here at the IES. Arden has a long and deep association with the university, and we're now very close neighbours in our new Bloomsbury home over in Bedford Square. It's been a special personal pleasure for me to have an excuse to be back in touch with Warwick, in fact, because I cut my editorial teeth many years ago now at Paulgrove Macmillan, working with Warwick on the Yeats Annual. But my duty this evening, which is of course a pleasure, is simply to introduce our speaker, Professor René Weis. René has been a part of the UCL fabric since 1980. He's an international Shakespearean with a well-deserved reputation for original thinking and a broad range of critical interests. His skills as a biographer shine out in his Shakespeare Revealed, which sadly I didn't get to publish, and his skills as an editor resonate through every page of his wonderful edition of Romeo and Juliet, which you would have noticed on your way in will be for sale afterwards, and René would be very happy to sign an edition if that would be of interest. The publication of Romeo and Juliet moves the Arden Third series ever closer to completion. We keep the faith, we will do it. The Arden is an extraordinary publishing project, and as such it attracts extraordinary scholars of the highest standing. And René most certainly represents Arden at our finest. We are rightly proud of his edition. His meticulous textual editing, his rich commentary notes, and his energetic enthusiasm for the play combined to create an edition which, I promise you, will reward many, many rereadings. His is an edition which above all places the play, as a play, centre stage, with Juliet at its core. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I give you René Weis speaking to us tonight about the challenges of editing Romeo and Juliet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you to the Institute of English Studies for having me and for hosting this wonderful occasion. It's a tremendous privilege for me and a pleasure to be here, needless to say. The challenges of editing Romeo and Juliet, well, I mean, when I was asked to do the play, I went home and I thought, after having said yes and having signed the contract, that's when I thought, am I up to it? And I kept telling myself, I've done this before, I've edited before, but this is Arden. And one of the challenges of editing an Arden is you join the Arden family, and they're notorious, I mean, they're legendary for being extremely thorough and for bracing feedback from the general editors, as all of us sort of have discovered over the years. It is also, I found a way, the most prestigious of all the Shakespeare editions, and to be asked to do Romeo and Juliet was an extraordinary privilege. It's a play which I've loved all my life, which everybody knows, whether they've read the play or not, as it were. Romeo and Juliet is simply the most famous play in the Shakespeare canon, bar none. It has an afterlife that is quite incomparable in terms of films, productions, and so on. There is in some ways no other work quite like it. If Shakespeare had written nothing else, he would still be the most famous dramatist of this recent Jacobean period. He would be more like Emily Bronte, if you like, with one fantastic book, one fantastic title to his name. I think the play's popularity is partly to do with this sort of thing, that is with this is everyone's idea of Romeo and Juliet, because we know, in fact, as you know, the play, the last line is about Juliet and her Romeo and their story of woe. The play is very much in some ways Juliet's, but here they are. The way most people seem to know them or think they know them. However, in spite of the enormous amount of information that we're given about Juliet in the play, in particular, we learn more about Juliet than about any other of Shakespeare's heroines. She has, in fact, the third largest female role in the Shakespeare canon after Cleopatra, and Rosalind and her lines are always almost as long as Romeo's in the play. Romeo's is the longest, then Juliet, and then the Friar. But we don't actually know what she looks like. I mean, is she tall? Is she short? After all, this play sits very close to Midsummer Night's Dream, where height, to Romeo and Helena, is important. Does she have blue eyes? Is she fair-haired? Is her hair golden as it is in the source? In the source, we're told Romeo and Juliet, they're both flat, so they're both golden hair. We don't know, but I mean, this is my generation's Romeo and Juliet. When we were teenagers, these people were teenagers, when we were teenagers, as it were. When I was a teenager, I should say, perhaps. And has come to distill the story. Everyone seems to know the story of Romeo and Juliet. It's about young love and death and innocence and idealism. And that must be why the play becomes so famous. Shakespeare did not invent the story of Romeo and Juliet. He found it more or less ready-made in a rather brilliant long poem of 1562, republished at least twice in his lifetime. And in this poem, we get the sense of Romeus, as he's known, and Juliet and Julietta in the poem. And Shakespeare ran with that, but he's the one who turned this story and gave it magic and life, turned it into the most popular, the most famous love story of all time. Now, for truly sophisticated people, this is also Romeo and Juliet, sort of more, if you like, ethereal version. Lynn Seymour as Juliet with Christopher Gable as Romeo, and Prokofiev as Romeo and Juliet, Royal Ballet. I'm showing this picture because it's so gloriously distilled, it seems to me, the sophisticated essence of the play, but also because a large number of adaptations of Romeo and Juliet don't have a single word of Shakespeare's language in it. So although Shakespeare and Shakespeare's rhetoric, and his rhetoric in the play is enormously wealthy and inventive, his rhetoric created this play ultimately. The fact is that some of the best known renditions, or if you like, reinventions of Romeo and Juliet don't have a single word in it, whether musically or otherwise. When I sort of joined the person I was going to work with originally was George Walton Williams. George Walton Williams is a living legend. He's just turned 90 and he works 16 hours a day and goes cycling and sailing. And he's an extraordinary character. We walked down Piccadilly together shortly after the appointment to the edition, and he said, and he kind of calls people young sir sometimes, and if they're younger than him. And he sort of pointed out that he used to be a drill sergeant in the army. His army days go back to D-Day +6. And I was sort of therefore on notice that there would be plenty of messages, and they would be tough, they wouldn't sort of be, as it were, particularly tactful, and I would have to fall into line. When I use the word like surfacing, something surfacing from the text, I got the message saying, we don't use words like surface unless it means coming to the surface, which isn't a very good word anyway. So I elided surfacing from my vocabulary. It hasn't been this ever since again. I had some 90 pages of notes from Professor Williams, and who was then joined subsequently by Anne Thompson, who's here, of course. And between them, Anne and George were incredibly useful and helpful sounding board. I have to say, I also did everything I was told to do, and so everybody was happy. There was no scope, no room for wackiness anywhere. Everything had to be sound and watertight, because that's the way things are done. And also because these editions have to ultimately stand on their own. Later, further on into the process, of course, I was joined by Jane Armstrong as copy editor, and when I emailed George Walton Williams and told him who the copy editor was, two different spellings of hurrah and hooray were all that he sent back, and we were in business, truly. Then came first proof. And the first proof, as you know, you take a deep breath and think, nothing can go wrong after this, because now we are at least in theory home safe and dry. And that's true, to some extent I think we were, except now Professor Professor Proudfoot, Richard Proudfoot, whose standards are legendary, he is here, I don't want to embarrass him, came into the fray and sent me 13 pages, I checked this morning, 13 pages of single-space commentary on my proof. He had read and collated everything. There were, unfortunately, mistakes in my collations, and I believe he spotted them all. There were things like long S's I had overlooked. There were the occasional rogue E at the end of a word in old spelling. There was a U for a V, as the Bees and Jacobean spelling headed. All these things were set right. And then there was something else. And this is what happened. And I checked this again, I mean, when I knew I was going to give this lecture, but at the time it gave me night sweats. Nothing did with this edition, but this particular thing did. There's a line in Romeo and Juliet, let me read them to you. It's Romeo talking to the friar. I pray thee chide me not, her I love now, doth grace for grace and love for love allow. He's just been told off by the friar for being fickle. He said, no, this one is different. Remember that Romeo has two girlfriends, one of them who may be Tybalt's sister. No wonder Tybalt is so cross with him. I don't know, but she may be. I pray thee chide me not, her I love now, doth grace for grace and love for love alone. I checked the text which Jane and I submitted to the printers, which did in fact read exactly like this. When it came back in print, and I thought I'd checked the copy properly, but I missed the fact that two words had fallen out of the text, and that was, doth grace and love for love allow, is what it read. And Richard, whom I shall be eternally grateful, spotted that for grace had fallen out, and the idea that the edition of such an important play might be out there with such a hammer is almost unthinkable. The world doesn't make sense any longer with that. But I thought what might seem on the face of overkill thoroughness was more than justified by my own experience. To have editors, general editors, like the ones I had. I mean, George Walton Williams told me he was on a train, the Eurostar train to Paris. He spotted across the compartment a poor soul reading Romeo and Juliet. So of course, George being George, got up, joined this person and gave him a tutorial, which I believe lasted all the way to Gare du Nord. Does he know that he was tutored, or maybe he does know, by the best person in the universe possibly on this play, because George Walton Williams, of course, himself, as Margaret and I often said, maybe ought to have been an editor, because he edited Romeo and Juliet brilliantly in 1964, with a seminal edition that, of course, we're still using. To have him, as it were, and of course Anne as well, literally there, an email away, was a tremendous privilege. We're going to come to some of the issues now that we had to tackle, and they'll tackle the textual history of this play is extremely complicated. Which is both good and bad. It allows you to make choices, and to some extent it allows you to put your character, or at least your understanding, what you hear, the cadences, the rhythms of the play that you hear, you the editor, it gives you some leeway, but of course everything was negotiated. Now, I mean, one of the most misleading statements of all time is this brilliant one by Ben Jonson. When Jonson wrote, I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honour to Shakespeare, that in his writing, whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out line. My answer has been, would he have blotted 1,000, which they thought a malevolent speech. But they knew Jonson, they knew it was a malevolent speech. But however, in their address to the great variety of readers in the first folio, where Jonson was also featured, and Jonson was featured there with an immensely powerful complimentary poem to Shakespeare's memory, in the first folio, Hamming and Condell noted that Shakespeare's mind and hand went together, and what he thought he uttered with that uneasiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. But it is, of course, we seem to have received lots of blots in this particular play, as far as we can tell. And from the one piece of, as it were, Shakespearean autograph that we have, the so-called Handine, Thomas Moore, it seemed that Shakespeare was quite an energetic, as it were, blotter of lines. In some ways, of course, we can't be absolutely sure that the Handine is Shakespeare's, but it seems very, very likely. And if it is, then I wonder, given the, as it were, the kind of directness of his blottings out, why he didn't do so in Romeo and Juliet, where the blotting out seems to be rather more discreet. I'm going to sort of go on to a very famous sort of crux in the play very early on. Remember, in this play there are 2 quartos. I mean, every edition of Romeo and Juliet on the market anywhere in the world is based on quarto 2, 1599. But there is an earlier quarto, a quarto, so-called quarto 1, 1597. Now, these 2 quartos are in some ways very closely linked. We can prove, we can show, demonstrate that when quarto 2 was set, that a copy of quarto 1 was available, because 85 lines in Romeo and Juliet, fairly along the play, come from quarto 1. Then there's another instance where clearly quarto 1 influenced quarto 2, but at the same time not providing the clue that is needed for the passage just above. So quarto 1 and quarto 2 are very close. Quarto 2, the main text, has about 3,085 lines. Quarto 1 is about 690 lines shorter. The 2 quartos overlap very closely for about 800 lines. So here we are, the presence of a text where some of the text of the play, with there are 2 early versions of it. I think no one could conceivably argue that quarto 2 was a revision of quarto 1. Can prove, as far as anything can be proven, that quarto 2, the later, the 1599 text, was based on Shakespeare's found papers, that is, on his own handwriting. The 1597 is immensely important, it's immensely valuable. Also, it is very close, as far as we can tell, to the time of composition of Romeo and Juliet. The date of Romeo and Juliet is one of the kind of hottest issue in the Romeo and Juliet story, and it bears on quite a few issues, including possibly even textual issues. I dated in late 1596. The reason for my dating it in 1596, which would make it about 7 or 8 months after A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now I know that many people think this is the other way around, and Oxford thought it was the other way around, and then they turned that on its head. Oxford was, first of all, it was Midsummer Night's Dream followed by Romeo and Juliet, and then it became Romeo and Juliet followed by Midsummer Night's Dream. The 2 plays are clearly linked, as you can imagine, through Queen Mab, Nightmares, through Pyramus and Thisbe, and so on. Stanley Wells, Jim spoke about this not long ago, now thinks that Romeo and Juliet comes later because of the extraordinary complexity of its rhetoric. The date in 1596 and late 1596 is to do with the first quarter. The first quarter, it says, this is the play that was played by Lord Hunsdon's men. Now, Shakespeare's company was only called Lord Hunsdon's men for a very short period of time, sometime between September or October, between September 1596 and April 1597. So there was a window of about 6 or 7 months when the company was called Lord Hunsdon's, who then became Lord Chamberlain afterwards, after April 1597. So in that window, if Romeo and Juliet was performed by Hunsdon's men, it must have been available for performance before 1597, before April 1597. That's sort of kind of by the way in terms of the history. There are other reasons for dating it post 1596, September 1596, because the play repeatedly echoes a particular text called Have With You to Saffron Walden, a sort of kind of pamphlet, and some kind of extraordinary phrases like fantasticos in Romeo and Juliet, or a word like single-souled, or the only use in all of Shakespeare of the word alligator come from Have With You, Saffron Walden. Have With You, as it's commonly called, was printed by the same person who printed Romeo and Juliet Quarto 1, a man called Dante, D-A-N-T-E-L. Dante printed both Have With You, which was available, we think we know, in any case, in manuscript in the summer of 1596, and then was printed by the same person who a few months later prints the first quarto of Romeo and Juliet. My point being that Have With You is very important, as far as I'm concerned, clue and source for dating Romeo and Juliet, the first quarter. But then the question is, why is the first quarter so different from the second quarter? But let me just sort of take, I'm not going to go into this to the text now, and I call it false starts, because one of the characteristic features of, if you like, the editorial history and challenges of Romeo and Juliet is precisely because there seem to be a number of false starts in the play. Now I'll just read you what we have. It's in Arden 3, 1, 2, Act 1, Scene 2, lines 13 to 18. It's Captain talking to Paris, who wants to marry Juliet, and her father says she's too young. And Paris says somewhat tactlessly, younger than her, had been mother's maid, and Capulet says, and too soon marred are those so early married. She is the hopeful lady of my earth. I put in square brackets, not in Q1. But woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. My will to her consent is but a part, and she agreed, within her scope of choice, lies my consent and fair according voice. Now, quarter 2, on which this is based, reads as follows: and too soon marred are those so early married. Earth has swallowed all my hopes, but she is the hopeful lady of my earth. But woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. And on the same slide, I give you another passage from the play, which has a bearing on how we read, and to some extent on our textual decision here. It's Capulet saying, wife, this is after Juliet has, as far as he knows, defied him. Remember, he was desperate to marry her off to Paris, because he doesn't know that she's already somebody else's wife. Wife, we scarce thought us blessed that God hath lent us but this only child, but now I see this one is one too much, and that we have a curse in having her. Now, how does that sort of bear on earth has swallowed all my hopes, but she is the hopeful lady of my earth? But first of all, the quarter taken on its own, I mean, without the further context of Act 3, Scene 5, makes one think that earth has swallowed all my hopes, but she is the hopeful lady of my earth. That this is either a complex, kind of over-emphatic statement and mystifying about, does it mean that there were other children apart from Juliet? That's what it could mean, certainly. She is the hopeful lady of my earth, but she's all that I have left. Well, there's a long debate about this, particularly with my editor George Warren Williams with this. And this passage, Capulet saying, too soon marred are those so early married. Everything else, in that rather long speech that comes, is rhyming couplets. The only two lines that don't rhyme in quarter 2 are earth is all my hope, but she is the hopeful lady of my earth. And so the lines are so close that there must be, given that there's a pattern, a wider pattern in the play of what seem to be false starts and rewritings, these two certainly look suspect. It doesn't necessarily follow, of course, that the second line, it just happened to come in this order in Q2. The second line may well be the original line, and the first line may be the rewriting. But it seemed in the light of Act 3, Scene 5, 1, 6, 4 to 7, that she is the hopeful lady of my earth, which is arguably more powerful than earth is all my hopes, but she, that we have to choose between one of these two. My journal editor was adamant that we should leave both of them out because they don't rhyme. There seem to be two separate false starts, possibly. After some discussion and interview on it as well, we decided that that was sort of my instinct, that to remove both would impoverish possibly the edition. To have one of these two, particularly the second, would, I suppose what it might do rhetorically is, because the line then becomes very isolated. This is the only line which is not tied to anything in this entire section of 20 lines or so to rhyme. So it stands alone and isolated. And perhaps so that might be an argument for having one rather than both or none. Now, I want to move on to another one where the rewriting is very clear and where we can be a bit more specific, perhaps, than can be with the first one. This is Romeo talking about having, he's now, it's Act 3, Scene 3, Tybalt is dead and he's going to be banned. More validity, he's talking to the friar, more validity, more honourable estate, more courtship lives, and carrion flies than Romeo. They may see the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand, and steal immortal blessing from her lips, who even pure and festal modesty still blush, as thinking their own kisses sin. But Romeo may not, he's banished. Flies may do this, but I from this must fly. These two lines are also like that. In Q1, they are free men, but I am banished, and sayest thou yet that exile is not death? Hadst thou no poison mixed, no sharp-drawn knife, no sudden mean of death, though ne'er so mean, but banished to kill me. The text in quarter 2, the equivalent text, this is the edited text, I've read you what we have in the Arden edition. In quarter 2 it says, reading from roughly line 40, I've numbered them A, B, C, D, and D, but that's roughly the equivalent of line 40 in the text above. This may flies do, well I from this must fly, and sayest thou yet that exile is not death, but Romeo may not he's banished. Flies may do this, but I from this must fly. They are free men, but I am banished. Clearly this may flies do, when I from this must fly. Flies may do this, but I from this must fly. Only one of these lines can be allowed in. It's clearly an issue of false starts, second thoughts, of rewriting. Currently, Calamore, on the spur of the moment, quite possibly. And so what we did in this instance is I went with I fell back on quarter 1, which is identical here, and went for, but Romeo may not, he's banished, flies may do this, but I from this must fly, accepting that something has gone wrong here in quarter 2. And while we were at it, we decided to move, as indeed has the editorial tradition, to move the lines about death, and sayest thou yet that exile is not death, and move that in front of the various means of death, which is where the lines seem to belong. So here there's been quite a bit of interference with the copy text, quarter 2. One of the lines has been deleted because the other line was deemed to be a revision, and another line has been shifted to a slightly different place. Now, there is, I'm not going to go into that, but there's a major instance of that in the famous Queen Mab speech, which seems to stand alone anyway in the play, rather awkwardly in some ways, where as it were, the editorial decisions are pretty substantial, and one has to decide on whether it should be prose or verse, where a number of lines, no fewer than 3 lines, are commonly shifted. If you look at 4 or 5 editions, you'll find that several of them will have different decisions on where to put certain lines in that speech. Partly because what must have happened is that when Q2, in that case in prose, was set, something was overlooked. I want to kind of look at another instance, another false dawn. I call it false dawn cheaply because dawn is the most important moment of the day in Romeo and Juliet. It's a play full of dawns. Remember, the play starts on a Sunday in the morning, and finishes on Thursday at dawn, just as it's going to be a wet day, indeed, a very sad day. This is Arden, this is Act 2, Scene 2. It's the end of Act 2, Scene 2. And it's about attribution, and here quarto is pretty strange. But this is the Arden text. I would have with her burn, sweet so would I, yet I should kill thee with much cherishing. Good night, parting is such sweet sorrow, that I shall say good night till it be morrow. Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast. Will I with sleep and peace so sweet to rest? The grey-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night, checkering the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and darkness fleckle like a drunkard reels from 4th day's pathway made by Titan's wheels. Hence will I to my ghostly sire's close cell, his help to crave and my dear hap to tell. Next scene, Act 2, Scene 3, and the Friar Lawrence alone with the basket. Now ere the sun advances burning eye, the day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry. I'm being slightly kind of over-emphatic here, and there's a reason for that. Just come back in just a moment. This alliterative line, the day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry. And the reason is this. This is quarter 2 now, the version of the same passage I've just given you, but now in quarter 2. Romeo is saying, sleep dwell upon their eyes, peace in their breast. This line incidentally is given to Juliet in quarter 2. Would I were asleep in peace, so sweet to rest. The grey-eyed morn smiles in the frowning night, checking the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and darkness fleckered like a drunkard reels from 4th day's pathway made by Titan's wheels. Hence will I to my ghostly sire's close cell, his help to crave and my dear hap to tell. And the Friar Lawrence. This grey-eyed morn smiles in the frowning night, checking the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and fleckered darkness like a drunkard reel from 4th day's path and Titan's burning wheels. Now, ere the sun advances burning eye, the day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry. Which is it? That's another full storm, this time in Q1, where, again, it's a slightly different reading, but the important point here is Q1. Q2 gives lines, or very similar lines, to both Romeo at the end of Act 2 scene, to the famous balcony scene. This is Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo, and so on and so forth. That very famous theme, one of the most famous theme in the language. And this is the end of it, as it were. And then in quarter 2, the friar starts with the same passage, more or less. Not quite the same, but almost the same. Now, clearly, they can't both be right. And again, a number of editions, because of Q1. Q1 gives them to the friar. So a number of editions have thought, well, it's in Q2, both given to Romeo and to the friar, but Q1, which is very similar, though not quite the same, gives them to the friar, so we should go with the friar. It's a moot point, isn't it? It's close call. It's not at all obvious. However, I think the line, the day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry, in the play has a function. I think the friar, it serves to flag up the friar. Remember, he's a benign person, ultimately, but unlike, and quite different from the friar in the source. The friar in the source is a reformed rogue. When he was a young man, the friar in the source, he kept a bedroom at his back, you see, where he serviced the young women of his parish. But the friar in the play, of course, couldn't be further from that. And for why does he play ball with the two young people? Because he thinks that out of their love will arise peace for the world, and the family's mad feud will cease to be. That's why he does it. There's no other motive. He's an upright man. But I mean, this business of the way he talks in this slightly pedestrian, clumsy way, it seems very hard to reconcile with the poetry of the grey-eyed morn smiles in the frowning night. And after some debate, that's in this case, probably mostly George Wharton Williams suggested that the lines should belong to Romeo. They might provide, tentatively, a poetic coda, a poetic kind of finale to the young man's leaving, as it were, the scene at that stage, rather than sitting, as it were, belonging to the friar. Who then changed immediately from kind of fairly sophisticated poetry to something slightly kind of clumsy and pedantic. Again, I think it's a close call. You have to kind of, it's a matter of weighing one's sense of scenic construction, of judgment, of what you hear, where. I mean, Romeo has spoken some fabulous poetry in Act 2, Scene 2, and so this sort of, as it were, finale, which is perfectly, as it were, well where it is, and clearly, quarter 2 puts them in both places. On the other hand, you see, the fact that quarter 1 seems to corroborate in this instance quarter 2, and therefore give the lines to the friar, is in fact one of the reasons why a number of editions, of other editions, give these lines to the friar. Another argument for giving them to Romeo, however, is that the Romeo version of, which is slightly different, I mean, from Fourth Day's Pathway, made by Titan's Wheels, if I did a Cambridge-style commentary analysis, I might say to you, which of these two lines is stronger, from Fourth Day's Pathway, made by Titan's Wheels, or from Fourth Day's Path and Titan's Burning Wheels? Which is stronger? Which is the one that is more Shakespearean, as it were? Very hard to know. But when a collection was published in the year 1600 called England's Parnassus, they picked a number of Titan passages from the poetry of the age, including, of course, Edmund Spenser and so on. And the one they chose was the Romeo version of these 4 lines. So Titan is the Titan of England's Parnassus, published in 1600, that is the year after the second quarto, goes for the Romeo version. And now to come to an issue that is of course, cuts to the chase. That's every edition of Romeo and Juliet, every mainstream edition has a number of stage directions in it, and there they are. the famous quarter one stage directions, which are unthinkable. It's unthinkable, it seems to me, not to have them in an edited version of the play, even though they are almost certainly not by Shakespeare. If you look at them, for example, the very first one, they're all from Q1. They draw, to them enters Tybalt, they fight, to them the prince, old Montague, and his wife, old Capulet and his wife, and other citizens, and part them. Let's just take that, this is a very early one, which is all that we can't reproduce in a standard edition of Romeo and Juliet, because this is actually a quarter one shortcut. This effectively does duty for about 15 lines or so in quarter two in any edited version. This is a narrative stage direction which tells you what happens, while quarter two, of course, gives you the action and the dialogue. So this is probably the one that nobody uses. However, almost all the others are used. Some of the very famous ones I've put I've bolded. Enter Juliet, somewhat fast, and embraces Romeo. Tybalt under Romeo's arm, thrusts Mercutio in and flies. Enter nurse, wringing her hands with a leather of cords in her lap. He offers to stab himself, and nurse snatches the dagger away. Again, a little bit further down on the same slide, she goeth down from the window. Remember that although we all talk about the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet, the word balcony never occurs in the play. It's always in the window, it's upstairs, admittedly, but the balcony is a sort of a fantasy. Romeo and Juliet without the balcony is unthinkable. At the same time, there's never any mention of a balcony in her home. In Act 4, Scene 5, again, she falls upon her bed within the curtains. Parry strews the tomb with flowers. Friar stoops and looks on blood and weapons. The fact that these stage directions occur in quarter one and are invariably grafted on by editors to editions of the play based on quarter two is very odd, because we do know, as I said earlier on, we can prove from the 85 lines in quarter two that are lifted verbatim out of quarter one, to the point also where, for example, features like italics in quarter one, Nurse's speech in quarter one was clearly in italic, written in some sort of European italic hand. That's why they are in italics in both quarter one and in quarter two. The moment quarter one and quarter two part company, Nurse's lines are no longer in italics. So because that's where the autograph kicks back in. So we can prove that quarter one, when quarter two was printed from Shakespeare's own foul papers, his own holograph, his own manuscript, quarter one was to hand. What is surprising is that although on the one occasion when for 85 lines, quarter one became the main source, presumably because there was a major problem at that point with the foul papers. We don't know what the problem was. Wouldn't it be wonderful if instead of 85 lines, it was something like, I don't know, 98 lines? Because 98 lines is what people have estimated Shakespeare wrote per page, basically. So if it were a missing page, and therefore quarter one was called upon, well, we can't be sure, we can't know. And the manuscript obviously was never far from the Saturday of quarter two. Why? It's interesting that the printers, the Saturday of quarter two, the compositors, did not fall back on the Q1 stage directions. They are there because editors love them. They seem to tell us so much. I mean, is it conceivable they reflect a performance of Romeo and Juliet out in the provinces? This is what people saw. That's the kind of hip version of what we would want to see there. We would want to know that these famous stage directions reflect the contemporary performance, if only. In fact, all the evidence points the other way. The evidence suggests that these are sort of semi-literary playhouses. They were written in by someone either on to the copy that became quarter one, and the person mostly in the frame is, of course, a man called Chattel, who certainly is the author of these stage directions who worked with this particular printer, who had been a printer himself as well as becoming a playwright subsequently. And there may be a clue in, if you look at some of them in more detail, let's for example take this one, which is a famous one of course, Act 3, Scene 2, 31. And the nurse wringing her hands with a ladder of cords in her lap. Oh, here comes my nurse, and she brings news, and every tongue that speaks but Romeo's name speaks heavenly eloquence. Now, nurse, what news? What hast thou there? The cords that Romeo bid thee fetch. Nurse, aye, the cords. Ay me, what news? Why dost thou wring thy hands? Now, it seems to me fairly, and to other editors who looked at this, fairly clear what's happened here is that whoever wrote in the stage direction and the nurse wringing her hands with leather of cords in her lap has read the text of Romeo and Juliet. He knows the play. He knows that the phrase, why dost thou wring thy hands? What hast thou there, the cords? Now, having said that, what I'm saying is that this is a literary, a sort of a stage direction written in after the text of the play. This particular version of the text of the play, which, as I said, is very different from Q2, bar 800 lines or so, but for the rest of it, it is very different. And some of the writing is quite brilliant, so much so that some people, a man called Sidney Thomas, has argued that some of Act 2 scene 6, the scene where Romeo and Juliet meet at the friars, is actually better in Q1 than in Q2. He's alone in that, thinking that, but it's an important point to make. Nevertheless, you know, he did a lot of work on this play. Thing here is, this is, I suggest, a stage direction not reflecting performance, but reflecting someone's sense of what the stage direction should look like. And this is true of the next one as well, and I'll come back in just a moment. This is again, this is Act 5, Scene 3, and it's Paris, it's line 11, that's what the stage direction is. Paris throws the tomb with flowers. Paris, sweet flower, dressed in Juliet, dead Juliet, so-called dead Juliet. With flowers thy bridal bed strew. Oh woe, that canopy is dust and stones, which with sweet water and nightly I will dew, or wanting that, with tears distilled by moans, the obsequies that I for thee will keep, nightly shall be to strew thy grave and weep. It says Page Whistles. Page Whistles is in quarter 2. It's quarter 2 stage direction. The one given in quarter 1 is boy whistles and calls my lord. And this is why. The boy gives warning something doth approach. What cursed foot wanders this way tonight to cross my obsequies and true love's right? What? With a torch, muffle me, night, a while. Clearly, here again, the stage direction of the text are entirely synchronized, which isn't particularly, sort of, I suppose, helpful. But what it does show, again, is the person writing in the stage direction, as indeed in this case here, knows the text of the play. Henry Chattel, and Chattel has been mentioned as someone who, I suppose, would have been doing a jobbing actor stroke writer's work. It is not, I think, by almost universal consent, either Shakespearean. This is indeed not Shakespeare stage directions, almost certainly not. If they were, we could almost be certain that quarter 2, when the second quarter was being printed, that they would have used them. I think they knew full well, because after all, the second quarter advertises itself as augmented. It's a different quarter altogether from quarter 1. In fact, it has even been argued, and quarter 1 was around, it was well known. Lucas Erner, who published an edited version for Cambridge of quarter 1, takes the view that it is quite possible that the reason why quarter 2 was published is because of the success of quarter 1. There might be a parallel there possibly with Hamlet, for all we know. I mean, but there's certainly an instance that this is a stage direction, even if it is a literary stage direction written in by someone who far from reflecting performance, in fact, laying down the rules as he sees it for how the play should be performed, for the gestures, for the entries and exits. What makes them immensely valuable is the fact that this is somebody who, as they used to say, he was there. Chattel contributed, if this Chattel contributed, he was born the same year as Shakespeare, in 1564, died in 1607. I think he had one play published, but didn't have much published anyway in his lifetime. But he must have known Shakespeare because he contributed, we think he contributed something to Thomas Moore, one of the plays where Shakespeare's hand has been suspected. So the argument is, about, if you want to be purist about this, and the only thing to do is to be upfront and say these are almost certainly not stage directions by Shakespeare, but they come from a source, a very important source, close to the play. Somebody who knew Quarter 1 of Romeo and Juliet very well, and who of course has a very clear idea of how plays should be performed, what should be in the stage direction, ideally, in a play of the period. The fact that he says, she goeth down from the window, is quite interesting, it seems to me. Clearly, he wouldn't say she goeth down from the balcony. If he said she goeth down from the balcony, we would think it's a forgery, probably. But down from the window, that's exactly what she's doing. The movement, the stage movement of Romeo and Juliet, with upstairs and downstairs, is immensely complicated and is almost impossible as an editor to write in appropriate stage directions. And my wonderful copy editor, Jane Armstrong, was terrifically helpful on trying to visualize how did it work with all the excellent entrances. Romeo and Juliet are in bed. Where do you show them? You can't show them upstairs. This is not a film. This is an Elizabethan Jacobean stage. You have to find a way of timing the exits and entrances, even if they're in different parts of the building, in such a way as not to be completely destroying the fabric of the play's cadences. It's a very important issue. Stage directions are hugely important. Sometimes they can go too far, and I remember another edition, who must have been nameless some years ago, writing in lots and lots of very colourful stage directions, and the editors were taking task for that. But this suggests to me that at the time it was perfectly acceptable for writers and dramatists, if it were, to write in very elaborate and very mandatory stage direction. There isn't a lot of room for Arden Juliet somewhat fast and embraces Romeo. This is how it's meant to be done. The status of Quarter 1 is disputed and remains disputed until the end of time. We know that Quarter 2 was set from Shakespeare's foul papers. There's all the features, classic features, characteristics of foul papers, and even some of the kind of phonic characteristics of the quarter suggest point towards Shakespeare's spelling habits that are fossilized, and the archaeology behind the printed version of Quarter 2 fairly clearly points towards foul papers. So the question then is, how come that there's a version, if 1599 Quarter 2 our sole, our only authoritative source, if that is a Shakespearean manuscript, what is the origin of the earlier version, the Quarter 1 version, printed so shortly by two different printers after the play was written? I think the play was written, in my view, after September 1596, by which time the Have Wit and Saffron Walden became freely available. It's also a play which sits, of course, strangely out of sync in the Shakespearean canon. Shakespeare with comedies and histories in the 1590s. He did not write tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, I remember being taught Shakespeare many years ago, just around the corner from here, at I think UCL. And the thing was, tragedy in the Western world starts with Hamlet, 2,000 years after Sophocles and Euripides. But of course, that's not quite true, is it? Tragedy starts with Romeo and Juliet. Why Romeo and Juliet, of course? 1596, Hamlet is still 4 or 5 years in the future. Clearly, after Hamlet, everything changes. Hamlet is a work of unimaginable range and scope and philosophical depth, rhetorical on every level. Frank Commodius argued that after Hamlet, everything in the Shakespeare canon changed. His way of thinking, his way of feeling, probably. In the meantime, there's Romeo and Juliet. Why Romeo and Juliet? At the time when Shakespeare was writing comedies, and was incredibly good at it. Some of us are old enough to remember the old exam questions about Shakespeare's achievement in Midsummer Night's Dream being at the pinnacle of comic achievement, while Romeo and Juliet was a learning curve. Shakespeare hadn't quite got there yet. Now, of course, it's true. Midsummer Night's Dream is a fabulous work. No one will take anything from it. The point about Romeo and Juliet is that there are in the play long goers. It is true. Some of the friar's speeches can be cut. Why then didn't quarter 1, which is much shorter, which is undoubtedly actable in 2 hours, 2 hours traffic of our stage, if that is the thinking behind cutting, behind the shorter version, why not simply cut? I can think of cuts in Romeo and Juliet. You cut the friar's homilies. What you don't do is cut some of Juliet's grand speeches, which is exactly what quarter 1 does. Why? It's very different, and in some ways, perhaps, for whatever reason, a semi-autonomous play. Romeo and Juliet comes when it does. Who knows why Shakespeare wrote the tragedy in 1596? I dare say, I'm almost tempted to be vulgar and suggest that it's to do with the fact that his son died in August 1596. It's conceivable that we have a tragedy about dead children. After all, it is a very painful work. I find Romeo and Juliet sadder than I find King Lear or Macbeth. Anathema that may be. I'm not saying it's greater or lesser, but it's a sadder play. It's a play of scapegoating, tragos, tragedy, scapegoating of 2 children dying where they didn't need to die. It was pointless, it's obscene, it's wicked. Shakespeare loves them. He gives them a wedding night just to make sure they don't lose out on everything, you see. At least they have that to think about in the hereafter, and they don't go to hell. After all, remember Hamlet, Cymbeline, all sorts of plays. Shakespeare takes a dim view of suicide. Mortal Sin, I seem to remember from my catechism class years ago, and also in Shakespeare's day. Not so in Romeo and Juliet. They're going to be a gold statue. They're going to be happy in the hereafter. They'll never be old. Like Keats' Grecian urn, they will always be beautiful, though frozen in time. There's another, I sort of mentioned Shakespeare's son. I would do that, of course, August, who died in August 1596. We know that because he was buried in Stratford-upon-Avon on the 11th of August of that year. But also because Juliet in the play, remember that Juliet is 13, which is one of the most extraordinary aspects of this play. Why does Shakespeare, who follows his source so closely, in Brooke she's 16, in other sources she's 18, why does he make her 13? Remember, the word 13 never occurs in the play, but her age is defined time and again, on 6 occasions, with reference to 14. She speaks 13 lines in the last scene of her life, and I find scene 3. There's no question that 13 is there for a reason. Kind of this sort of sinister 13, fated, doomed, bad luck, it certainly is. But her double, Nurse's daughter, you recall, Nurse's daughter was called Susan. Now the word name Susan occurs twice in Shakespeare, twice in this play, and nowhere else in the entire canon. Susan was too good for me, Nurse says. Susan is with God. That's the reason why Nurse became Juliet's wet nurse, because she had a baby at the same time as Juliet's mother. Now, I'm not saying that this is to do with Susanna Shakespeare. Yes, I probably am saying there's a link of some sort. I'm sorry to be so cheesy about that, but and defensive. But it does seem an extraordinary coincidence that this bit of 13, that Shakespeare's daughter Susanna was 13. On her epitaph in Stratford-upon-Avon, where she's buried next to, very, very close to her father, it says, that she was witty above her sex, but that's not all. Wise to salvation was Mrs. Hall. Something of Shakespeare was in that. I'd like to think that her father knew that this man with the most extraordinary rhetorical intelligence of anyone who's ever spoken English, by the sounds of it, as far as we can tell, would not have used a name like Susan, which is not in the sources, quite willfully or abstractly thinking, I must have a name for Nurse's daughter. She lives in Italy, she's called Angelica. We think she's called Angelica in the play. I'll call her Susan. Very kind of Italian name. It's like Gregory. The very first word of Romeo and Juliet is Gregory. Gregory, excuse me, Giorgio or something, but not Gregory. Unless, presumably, if you said Gregory is in England, you'd be thinking of, well, I suppose Pope Gregory. You would know you were in Italy, you would know you were in some Catholic place where things happen that can't happen in England, you see. The fact that Juliet, how it's changed from Giulietta to Juliet, and the Romeo is changed from its Romanitas, the Roman Romeos. It's called Romeos in the source, as you may know, except one occasion. It's called Romeo once in the Brook poem to rhyme with Mercutio, it's called Mercutio. But otherwise he's Romeos. But Romeo, yes, Romeo and Giulietta, why not call her Giulietta? Is it to do with the fact possibly that she's English Juliet after all? That somehow then Juliet allows us to get inside the character with Giulietta might not quite be part of the fact that Giulietta might be very hard to rhyme in English over a period, whereas Romeo is very easy to rhyme. It rhymes with woe. Never the story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. Well, it's a pretty good story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, René. That was wonderful. I knew it would be. And what I found particularly reassuring, actually, was having put René through the various mills he described of the Arden process, his passion for the play, his just fascination with the challenges it threw, just really came across, and that's what you get in the edition. Now, I don't want to keep people from the glass of wine that you're promised, but we do have time maybe for just one or two quick, to the point questions anyone would like to ask. Yes, Graham.
Graham Holderness. If the stage directions are interpolated, as you suggest, then that implies that the authorial text was content with implicit internal stage directions. And anybody who writes for the theatre knows that the only point of putting in a stage direction is if you know what kind of theatrical context the play is going to work in. So if Shakespeare himself produced plays which were available for adaptation in a range of theatrical contexts, and the stage directions then had to be added by other people, then shouldn't you really exclude the stage directions and just give us the authorial text?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the stage directions are very important. I absolutely agree. I think they are wonderfully interesting and so on. But I think the ones in Q2, for example, unlike the ones in Q1, are very much kind of to do with exits and entrances, and they're brief and to the point, and they feel, if you like, kind of tough and professional. Which these are kind of baroque and they're infinitely more interesting. I mean, on one hand, just that very last one again, where the boy whistles and calls, my lord, as opposed to page whistles. And that's just not the best example, but there are plenty like that. I mean, Q2, which I believe is based on Shakespeare's Farrell papers, comes with a full set of stage directions, but they're very short, they're to the point, and they don't try and duplicate the text. I think it'd be interesting to know, did Shakespeare write his own stage directions? He must have done. Quite a few stage directions that were in Q2 are of the order of Enter Mother and Father, Enter 3 or 4. This is the so-called permissive stage directions, which suggest that, it's mother and father who matter as opposed to who they are precisely. Interesting in that context, for example, we know that in the passage where quarto 2 was set from quarto 1, let's call it Mrs. Capulet or Lady Capulet, Mrs. Capulet, is called wife in the speech headings. But the moment the two texts part company, once quarter 2 is being set again from foul papers, she becomes old lady in the speech heading. She's actually old lady at the very moment where she is talking about how she was younger than Juliet when she had Juliet, as it were. And so, it couldn't be more incongruous. And you think, why is Shakespeare, this is his own handwriting, his own holograph, why would he call Lady Capulet, or Mrs. Capulet, why would he call her old lady throughout the scene? She's called wife in quarter 1, then quarter 1 and quarter 2 part company, and you're back to old lady repeatedly, time and again. Why? Presumably because, see, that stage imagining that the scene is all about contrast. Juliet is very, very young and waiting, and they know that Paris wants to marry her, but they want her to have her say in it. And Nurse is called old, and yet, I mean, Nurse, I mean, how old is Nurse? If Nurse, well, Nurse is meant to be in her 20s, even though she has no teeth left, only a few teeth left. And so she's obviously not in her 20s, but somehow she was Juliet's wet nurse, and Juliet is 13. So there's something biological not quite sound about the play properly. But to my teen beast vote, she said, I've got 4 left. She's toothless, and therefore presumably old. She's sort of like a kind of a latter-day wife of Bath. She's raucous, but she's benign, because she's also cynical and pragmatic. That's why that wonderful phrase Juliet says, ancient damnation, the glorious phrase, you see, that's her said just before she faces suicide. And she has this long tragic sleep. Sorry.
Brian.
Thanks, Warren. Thank you. Could we go back to the speech which occurs both in Romeo's part and the Friars, the grey-eyed morn? That's the bit, thanks very much. The question is, how has that got into both parts? How, in terms of mechanical processes? And there has, as you know, been the theory that Shakespeare could have written these 4 lines on a piece of paper which is stuck in the edge of his manuscript with a pin or whatever, and the printer has put it in the wrong place. But looking at it again, and you said that you think that the first one is the more important, more strikingly Shakespearean. Could it be that Shakespeare has written out a passage to, as it were, replace the one that's presently shown under Friar Lawrence, pinned it in the margin, intending it to go in for Friar Lawrence, but the printer has mistake put it in Romeo's part. I, for one, if you compare Romeo's speech, the 2, even though that's the Q2 one at the beginning, the first 2 lines and the last 2 lines are remarkably simple, syntactically simple, and they've each got about 9 or 10 words filling out the line. Whereas these 4 lines are a unit which, as it were, you wouldn't begin speaking until you knew that you were going to get to the end. You have to have that unit of 4 lines, as it were, ready in your mind before you can utter them. Just, jokingly imagine that. And I don't think Romeo's got the time to get involved in a sequence of morn, night, eastern light, darkness, drunkard, day, titan. So, have I been editing this play? I would have put the second, the Romeo thing in the Friar's part, but this is just to show that the problems will go on, as you rightly say, forever and ever.
But also, thank you very much, Brian. Of course, it also, that's the very similar thing happened in the Queen Mab's speech, where there are 3 lines where suddenly, I think it's C2 recto, where the prose, where the speech suddenly, it's clearly a speech written in verse, and it's almost identically there in quarter 1. And yet, in quarter 2, it becomes a very congested page of prose. And that must be because something turned up at the last minute, and they decided that one way of doing it was to, which they did repeatedly, turned into to bunch it as close as they could, because something had turned up, and the 3 lines had turned up at the ones about the fairest coachmaker, which seemed to have suddenly ended the play, possibly as a piece of rewriting or something that Shakespeare added that was missed and then was reset. We only have, as you know, 5 copies of Q1 and 13 of Q2, which means that although Richard would know about the C2 recto is probably corrected, there isn't enough of a sample out there for there to be, well, unless we were extremely lucky, for there to be an uncorrected C2 recto. So if there were, you could be certain, you could be at least more confident. Yes, thank you.
thank you. I think we should draw things to a close because I think probably we would be here all night. But thank you for your questions. And I know René will be happy to chat and answer other questions afterwards. But please just join me in thanking René again for a spectacular lecture.